And away we go. This talk is going to be based upon an article which I have written, a feature article, in the May edition of Sky and Telescope magazine. So if you go to a bookstore or place that sells magazines, you might be able to pick up a copy for yourself, and then you'll have basically the whole background of this talk in hand, and we'll be able to make a reference to it whenever you care to. The story begins 92 years ago with these two gentlemen. The gentleman on the left is Arnold Schwachmann, and the gentleman on the right is Arno Wachmann. And these two were the dynamic duo, celestial events-wise, of the observatory in Germany. Back in 1930, they made a number of different discoveries. This was going to be their third comet discovery. So this comet was known as Comet Schwachmann-Wachmann 3. From here on, I'm going to refer to it as SW3. When the comet orbit was discerned, when they had enough observations and were able to define where the comet was going out in space, they made an interesting discovery. The comet was going to pass rather close to the Earth at the end of May in 1930, 5,735,400 miles. Now, when a comet gets that close to the Earth, it either is going to evolve into a spectacular sight because it's so close, or at the very least, an interesting sight. And in the last 40 years, we've had a very close passage with a comet. This was back in 1983, the comet Iras-Araki-Alcock. That comet came within 2.9 million miles of the Earth. So close, in fact, that you were able to see it move across the sky from one end of the sky to the other over a span of just a few nights. And it wasn't a spectacular comet, as you see in this photograph from the newspaper Newsday. It looked like a fuzzy ball, approximately the brightness of the North Star. But it still was interesting to see how quickly it moved across the sky from one constellation to the next. And then 13 years later, we had another close approach of another comet. This was Hyakutake. Hyakutake was discovered by a Japanese observer, and this came within 9 million miles of the Earth in March of 1996. And indeed, it was a hit. It was much brighter than Iras-Araki-Alcock and had a long tail, which in dark sky areas far from light pollution, stretched more than halfway across the sky. The most interesting photograph of this comet was taken not from a dark sky area, but from 29th Street and Avenue of the Americas, where someone at about 1:30 in the morning took his camera, pointed it up toward the spire of the Empire State Building in light-polluted Midtown Manhattan, and was still able to capture the coma or head of Comet Hyakutake. That gives you an idea of how bright this comet was. It was able to be seen even through the light-polluted skies of Midtown Manhattan. Unfortunately for Comet SW3, the comet that was discovered in 1930 at Hamburg, Germany by Schwachmann and Wachmann, this comet was not interesting, nor was it spectacular. In fact, you see the nucleus of the comet here. It was probably no more than a mile across. Halley's comet is about 10 miles across. Comet Hale-Bopp is 25 miles across. So this was a puny little comet, not visible to the unaided eye, only visible if you had a good pair of binoculars or a telescope. So it was not really a spectacular sight. Nonetheless, because it was coming so close to the Earth, again, less than 6 million miles away, the comet was observed by observatories all over the world. One of the people who was especially interested was this gentleman. His name was George Van Beesbroek. Van Beesbroek, known to his friends as Van B, worked at the Yerkes Observatory telescope, the 40-inch Yerkes, the biggest refracting telescope still to this day. And he was interested in comets and asteroids and meteoroids. Here you see him. Can you imagine having access to a huge telescope like this? This guy certainly had the biggest telescope on the block. But he saw it, he observed it. It was most interesting to track, even though it was never a spectacular sight. And then after the comet passed the Earth on May 31st, and he did take some photographs. This is not 10 feet. This is 10 arc minutes. The comet, a couple of weeks before it made its closest approach, was about 2/3 the apparent size of the full moon. And when it made its closest approach on May 31st, The comet was evident, the nucleus, the teeny nucleus of the comet was evident as, according to Van Beesbrook, a spindle-shaped tiny star-like object surrounded by this glowing coma of gas. Anyway, after 1930, the comet went back out into space. The comet orbit was predicted to be on the order of 5.5 years. So every 5.5 years, this comet would return, but it was missing in action. For all of the years that you see here, the comet passing the sun on the specific dates in question, but no one ever got a chance to see it. Why? Well, there are two good reasons. Number one, the comet was a very small comet, a very faint comet, very dim, hard to see. And number two, the comet was under the influence of this big guy. This is the planet Jupiter, biggest planet in the solar system. And every time the comet was out at the far end of its orbit in space, it was near Jupiter's orbit. And if Jupiter happened to be in that vicinity when the comet was there, Jupiter would say, "Hey, come over here," and pulled on the comet and pulled it a bit off its normal orbital track. And this also may have led to what eventually happened to this comet, because being pulled by Jupiter, the biggest planet in the solar system, against a tiny little speck only about a mile or so across, that comet was under a certain amount of pressure and forces that eventually may have led to not its end, but what, as I said, eventually would take place to it. This comet, SW3, is in fact one of about 400 comets that have been captured by Jupiter. This is the orbit of Mars that you see here. This is the orbit of Jupiter. And Jupiter's captured about 400 of these. We call this Jupiter's family of comets. Jupiter has captured 400 small comets, and they all travel around in orbits in the general vicinity of Jupiter every 6, 8, 10 years. And again, every once in a while, Jupiter will tug on them, pull on them, change the orbit slightly. And that's why, you think you have a good handle on the orbit of this comet, and then Jupiter comes along, pulls it off course, and you may be pointing your telescope in the wrong part of the sky. That, plus the fact, again, there was a rather faint object. In 1990, though, luck was with us. The comet made a relatively close approach, came within 30 million miles of the Earth. We got a good view of it. We got a good fix on its orbit, and we pretty much had a good idea where it was going to be and where it was in the past and where it was going in the future. Now we come to 1995. The comet was coming back in September of that year, and this is not a gigantic fence. This is a radio telescope, the Nankai radio telescope outside of the observatory in Paris, France. And the Nankai radio telescope was fixed on the comet SW3, and started noticing something very unusual. The comet began to outgas much more quickly than normal. In other words, the gaseous frozen gases within that comet began to be expelled much more quickly, more rapidly than normal. And then the comet started to get bright, much brighter than predicted. In fact, the Smithsonian Observatory in Cambridge, Massachusetts, put out a special circular about this comet to help amateur astronomers and professional astronomers find it in the sky. But they headlined it this way: the Bureau, the Central Bureau for Astronomical Telegrams, has received numerous reports from observers worldwide of independent discoveries of this comet, which has continued a remarkable outburst in brightness. Now, it's October of 1995. You step outside, you're getting ready to spend the entire night with your telescopes and observe, and you may even have an observing program set. The sky gets dark, and as it gets dark and as your eyes get used to the darkness, you look around toward the western part of the sky, and you see this, and you say to yourself, what is that? What is that? It looks like a fuzzy patch of light in the sky. You point your binoculars at it, and you say to yourself, that looks like a comet. You point the telescope and you say, my goodness, it is a comet. And suddenly, the little beat of the heart, comes. You say, I think I discovered a comet. And of course, if you're among the first 3 people to see a new comet, your name gets attached to it. But what's happening to you must have been happening all over the world. People looking up into the sky and seeing a comet where there was none before on previous nights. A comet visible dimly to the unaided eye. What is this? And the Central Bureau for Astronomical Telegrams told them, it's comet Shwachman-Wachmann 3, SW3. How could that be, you may ask? Back in 1930, the damn thing was less than 6 million miles away, and you still needed binoculars or a telescope to see it. Now, in 1995 October, it's 122 million miles away, 25 times further out in space, and yet here it is. You could see it without binoculars, without a telescope, with your unaided eye. More than 400 times brighter than what it was supposed to be. And one of the foremost comet observers, Terry Lovejoy in Australia, commented later on that it looked like a mini Halley, a miniature Halley's comet, with a coma displaying a striking parabolic outline, tail so intense in the first half degree that the ghostly glow was visible even when it was down near the horizon, in the horizon haze. Well, this is something. Why would this comet get so bright? Tremendously bright. And we soon learned the reason, or we saw the reason. In a telescope, the comet head looked rather bloated. And then in early December, boom! The comet broke into 4 separate fragments. And you got to think back to what I told you about when it was passing Jupiter all those years, and Jupiter tugging here and pulling here and pushing there. That tiny little comet must have been under a certain amount of stress. And now in October of 1995, when it was closest to the sun and experiencing sunlight and heating up, all of that combined, and the comet probably just said, I can't take this anymore, poof, and broke into 4 different parts. And there you go. And when it broke into 4 parts, when it cracked open, so to speak, all of the dust, all of the material that was inside that comet went flowing out. There was a tremendous expulsion of material that went out into space with the fracturing of this comet. When it came back in 2001, we see several fragments quite readily in special filtered views, photographic views. But in 2006, that's when everybody was really getting excited. The comet, or comets, was going to pass within 7 million miles of the Earth, as close as it had ever came since 1930. And now there wasn't just 3 or 4 pieces. The comet continued to break up and fracture into many other pieces, so many that they started to add the letters of the alphabet to categorize them. Here would be fragment A and B and C and D and E and F and E. You get the idea. So now the comet is coming real close to the Earth in 2006, and it's now no longer just observatories on Earth looking at it, but we have 2 big observatory telescopes. We have, for example, the Hubble Space Telescope moving around and looking skyward, took a look at 3 of the fragments of SW3, and then it honed in on one of the bigger fragments, fragment B. And look at this. Fragment B, they saw, was breaking up in its own right. Fragments of the fragment. And now more and more pieces being jettisoned out into space. Amazing. And then after the Hubble Space Telescope was done with it, we had the Spitzer Space Telescope looking at it with infrared photography. And look at this now. You could see one big fragment here, then here's 2 little ones here, a bigger fragment, then another one, and another one, and another one, another. And you could actually see a line or stream of debris along the orbit of the comet. When all was over, said and done, in 2006, we counted over 60 fragments of this comet. The comet was literally falling apart right before our eyes. Here is the orbit of the comet. It takes 5.5 years to go around the sun, as I said. When it was over near here, near the orbit of Jupiter, if Jupiter was in this vicinity right about here, not all the time, but some of the time, that's when it was doing its dirty work and pulling and tugging and pushing this comet every which way. But notice here in this diagram, this is the orbit of the Earth right here. See, that's us going around the sun. And here as the comet is coming downhill, so to speak, in its orbit toward its closest approach to the sun, right here, the comet's orbit practically coincides with ours. So the question now is, with the comet breaking up into so many different pieces, is it possible that maybe some of those pieces might interact with the Earth? Might it be that we could actually see a meteor shower, or maybe even something greater, if the Earth contacted any of that material at the point in its orbit, which is May 31st, right here where the 2 orbits seem to coincide? And there's a precedent for this. In the 1800s, in the early 1800s, a comet was discovered by another German, Wilhelm von Biela. And in 1842, Biela's comet broke into not four, but two pieces. And we saw basically twin comets. In 1846, the comet goes around the sun. It's another one of those Jupiter family members. And so, like SW3, it doesn't take a whole heck of a lot of time to go around the sun. So we saw it in 1846 as twins. We saw the twin comets again in 1852. And then in 1858, the comet was supposed to reappear, and it didn't. And in 1865, the comet was supposed to reappear, and it didn't. And by then, everybody, all the astronomers said, well, it broke up into two pieces. And sometime after 1858, the thing just broke apart completely, disintegrated, and is now no more. We're never going to hear from Biela's comet again. And then November 27th, 1872 came, and the comet came back. It left its calling card, but not as twin comets. Instead, that night, as darkness fell over Europe, surprise! Surprise! Nobody expected this. We reached the crossing point with that presumably dead comet. But the comet, the pulverized remains of Biela's comet, were now firing through our atmosphere and producing a magnificent display of meteors, shooting stars. And not just a few. We saw, depending upon how dark your sky was and how quick your eye was, there were reports of anywhere from 3,000 to 10,000 shooting stars in the course of an hour's watch. Amazing. Amazing. One of the most glorious displays of meteors and shooting stars that we had ever seen, ever recorded. Well, could this happen again now with SW3? Well, actually, when the comet SW3, Schwarzkopf 3, was discovered in 1930, a Japanese astronomer said, I think we might have a meteor shower from this. And in fact, another Japanese observer said, yeah. And in fact, he says that he saw a meteor shower on the night of June 10th and 11th in 1930, producing 60 to 70 shooting stars per hour. Now, it turns out this Japanese fellow was the only one to see this meteor shower. Everybody who looked for the shower around the world didn't see a single meteor, but this Japanese fellow did. And the director of the local observatory, the Nissan Observatory, said, he claims to have very sensitive eyes. Except these meteors that were seen were very, very dim, very faint, barely visible to the unaided eye on a dark, clear night. And that is the problem with this report of this supposed meteor shower, because it wasn't dark and it wasn't clear. Instead, this one Japanese observer claimed to see this meteor display on the night of a full moon, for goodness sake. You know what happens on a night of a full moon. It squelches the light of all but the very brightest stars. And here we're talking about very, very dim streaks. And also, look, on that night, the moon had a ring around it. That meant there were high clouds in the sky, cirriform clouds. Oh, my goodness. After knowing that, did this guy actually see meteors at all? Again, no one else in the world saw it. So that claim that there was a meteor shower back then is kind of put by the wayside. It's really hard to believe. But when comets do come around the sun, they are cosmic litter bugs. They get close to the sun's heat gradually warms those frozen ices, and embedded in the ices are pieces, particles, that are then loosed, set free into space. And they travel, the tiny particles do, along the orbit of the comet. As I said, comets are like cosmic litter bugs, and if we go through the trail of this material and they run into our atmosphere at high speeds, we see them as shooting stars. Now, when I tell people we've got a meteor shower coming, this is probably what they're thinking of. They're probably thinking of those terrible science fiction movies or TV shows like Lost in Space back in the 1960s, thinking about these huge chunks, these big boulders hitting. No, that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about meteor showers. Instead, the particles in question are generally no bigger than pebbles or sand grains or dust. That's how big the particles are when they impact our atmosphere to create the sight of shooting stars. Now, in 2005, there was a technical paper written about this particular comet, SW3, Schwackman-Bachmann 3. And the meteor supposedly that was seen in 1930 came from the constellation of Hercules near the star Tau Hercules. So they were called the Tau Herculid meteors. And this paper that was written by three well-known meteor experts, Paul Weigert, Peter Brown, and Helen Shinge, these three from the University of Western Ontario enlisted the aid of Jeremy Vabalyon. And Vabalyon is a very important person in meteor science. He developed about 20 years ago a computer program that helps to evaluate comets and helps to predict whether the Earth is going to be impacted by material from a comet by tracking the amount of material that the comet sheds in space and whether or not they would be on a course to possibly impact the Earth. And the final analysis of this paper, again written in 2005, was that the scientists said, looking at the future, no significant number of meteoroids released during the 1995 splitting of Schwackman-Bachmann 3 is expected to encounter the Earth in 2022. Oh, darn it. Darn it. I read this paper and I said, well, I guess we're not going to see a celestial pyrotechnics display because these experts are saying it's not going to happen. And Professor Valbalyon's simulator, which does very good jobs of simulating potential meteor showers, said, no, it's not going to happen. So it's not going to happen. But still, curiosity got the best of me. And so what I did was that I, with my own PC, I inputted the orbit of the comet, SW3, and then I created my own trail of debris following the comet in its orbit around the sun. And I said, I want to see for myself. I want to see if indeed this comet and its trail of dusty debris is going to miss us. So I set up the program in my computer simulator, and then I started the simulation. And here you see Mercury and Venus, and here's the orbit of the Earth. And here's where the comet orbit is and where it intersects the orbit of the Earth. And boom, here we are at the intersection, the crossing point. But where's the comet? Where's the trail of debris following it? Oh, well, I guess Professor Vabalyon was right. Once we moved away from the intersection point, yeah, sure enough, in August of this year comes the comet and the trail of debris. So, Bachagaloop, no meteor shower, nothing. Nothing is going to happen in 2022 with this comet. But then I got to thinking, this is not a normal situation. The comet fractured. The comet broke up into 4 parts, and those 4 pieces in themselves have been slowly disintegrating. And I said, the particles that are involved here are not dust size or sand grain size, not teeny tiny particles. I am sure that in most of this debris that was expelled when the comet fractured back in 1995, that there must be many pieces much larger than that, much larger than sand grains, probably big pebbles, big chunks, maybe chunks as big as a golf ball or a walnut or whatever. And that's an important thing to think of. You see, when you're dealing with little tiny particles like sand and dust, the light of the sun helps to push that material away from the comet behind it. And a lot depends also upon how the nucleus of the comet rotates and the comet's orbit and the outgassing of jet gases. A lot of that depends upon how much of the material gets blown back. But like I said, the sun does a lot of the work with its radiation, pushing that material behind the comet. Now, it sounds kind of strange when I tell you that light has pressure. It doesn't seem right. If you were to take your hand and if you put it up against or up near an electric light, as you see this person doing right now, you don't feel anything. I mean, the fact that light has push or pressure might sound strange, but nevertheless, light does have pressure. Noticeable only when the light becomes extremely strong, like when it's near the sun. Now, the small particles, as I said, are pushed away more rapidly by the radiation pressure from the sun. But particles that are bigger than grains of sand are greatly unaffected by solar radiation pressure. So in other words, when we had the comet break apart and these bigger pieces came out of the eruption, no, it's like the big bad wolf pushing, blowing on the brick house. The sun pressure, the radiation pressure can push on those big pieces as much as it wants, trying to blow and blow and blow, but those pieces are not going anywhere. And if they end up in front of the comet, on the part that is coming out in front of it, instead of going behind it, that's where they're going to stay. So maybe, just maybe, there are pieces that are forward of the comet, not necessarily trailing behind, as you see here again, but maybe they're out front of the comet. And in that case, what I did was I went back to the computer, went back to the drawing board, so to speak, and this time I placed the material not behind the comet, but in front of the comet. And then I started the simulator again. Here comes the Earth around the sun. Again, there's that intersection point. But look, there is the dusty material. This is the stuff that is riding ahead of the comet. I created 20 different particles here, and it looks like the Earth is somewhere between particle 12 and 13, and this is about the 28th of May. So yeah, maybe, just maybe, this will work if we assume that the material is in front of the comet in its orbit around the sun instead of behind. And then after I found this out, I kind of honed everything. I took that one segment of the comet, that one segment of the trail of debris, and I closed in on it a little bit more, and I wanted to see more precisely where the Earth would be when it interacts with that material. So here are 20 particles here. Here's the Earth. There's the intersection point. And indeed, the Earth is going to interact with at least 5 of those 20 pieces. 5 of those, and as it turns out, you get May 29.74 UT. That's UT is Universal Time or Greenwich Time. And my computer program is not the most exact in the world, so there's a margin of error of 1.5 days either way. But anyway, what my calculations indicated was that, yes, there is a chance that we could see a meteor shower sometime between May 28th and May 31st. Somewhere in that 4-day time frame, we would probably have a shot at seeing a noticeable display of meteors from Comet SW3. So we were in the pandemic at that time, and I said, well, like so many others, I didn't have anything else to do. So I sat down and I wrote a technical paper. I wrote a research paper, 12 pages in length, had it vetted. It was published in the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, very, very distinguished a journal in astronomy. And it was published. I asked the question, will Comet SW3 produce a meteor outburst in 2022? Now, when you publish an article like this, it's read by academicians all over the world. And sure enough, 2 teams of meteor experts, one of them was in Germany, a paper that was written by Hartwig Luthern and Rainier Alt and Michael Jaeger, and in Japan, Sean Hori, Junichi Watanabe, Mikaya Sato. These 2 teams decided that they would do calculations on their own based upon my suggestion that the material is forward of the comet, not behind, but forward. And as it turns out, they came up with a time of their own. In fact, both of these teams, independent of each other, came upon the same time and the same day. They came within 4 minutes, for goodness sake, of each other. May 31st, 12:57 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. That is when we may see the peak of this potential meteor display. I want to tell you now that I would go with that time more than my time, because again, my time, there was like a margin of error of 3 or 4 days. These guys know their stuff, and they're using special computer software, supercomputer guides. So I would probably go with this time and this date for any potential or prospective shower. But I was most happy about this. You remember that original paper in 2005? And remember, I mentioned the Frenchman, Jérémy Volbien, who had his special computer simulator, and he made the declaration, no, No, I don't see any chance we will encounter a meteor display in 2022. Well, after my paper came out, he looked at it. He made some revisions to his calculations, and then he published another study. And in that study, he wrote, Joe Rayo in 2021 published a study showing that meteors ejected at a higher velocity will definitely cause a meteor outburst. He explored also the influence of the change of the comet orbital elements. In this study, we confirm Joe Rayo's findings. Oh my goodness! And go slightly further, exploring the conditions that make the shower possible. I sent Professor Valballion a short email and I said, Merci beaucoup, thank you so much. So now we have somebody with a high reputation saying, yeah, it's possible that when the comet broke apart into 4 pieces and much smaller pieces went out into space, that some of this could be forward of the comet and may possibly cause a meteor shower. So that's good. So now the big question is, how many meteors are we going to see that night? Will it be a lot? Will it be a little? Well, in 2017, the Earth passed within about 102,000 miles of some debris that was shed by comet SW3 back in 1941. Back in 1941. And remember, the comet was not several pieces. It was not a whole bunch of material. It was one singular object. And it threw off just enough debris so that we saw in 2017, on May 31st, about 5 shooting stars, 5 meteors per hour. Now let's look at what's coming our way in 2022. If we calibrate what we may see this year versus what happened in 2017, we are 3 times closer to the center of this zone, and this is where all the good stuff is. This is where all of the particles are for the most part. We missed out in 2017, missing the 1941 debris, but we're going to go right through part of the 1995 material here. And with about 3 times closer. So that means we should get, from a scalability standpoint, about 14 shooting stars per hour. I don't think that's all that much, and I don't think that's all that great. But remember that this is all contains the material of the comet when it broke up in 1995. So the question is, how much more concentrated is the material here in 1995 compared to the material that was shed by the comet in 1941? Well, why don't we go this way? Is it 10 times more concentrated? If it's 10 times more, 10 times 14 would be 140. So maybe we would see a meteor outburst of 140 shooting stars per hour. Look at that. You'd be seeing meteors flying by at the rate of 2 per minute. That's pretty good. That's certainly worth noting, and certainly worth going out and looking for in the nighttime sky. But wait a minute. Hold on for just a moment. And you're probably wondering, why am I bringing this guy up? I'm sure Heidi and Bill, you have at one time seen on television this man. He's on PBS. He has a show called The Joy of Painting. This gentleman's name is Bob Ross. And in a half an hour, Bob Ross will create a masterpiece on canvas. He has a special technique called the wet on wet technique. So why am I bringing Bob Ross into a discussion about meteors? I bring him up because if you've ever watched this guy paint, about half or 3/4 of the way through the show, he'll look at you and he'll smile that wry little smile and he'll say, let's get crazy. And then after that, after he says, let's get crazy, he does crazy things. Like all of a sudden, within a matter of minutes, he'll add a whole bunch of trees, or he'll create a cabin out in the woods, or he'll create mountains or pond or whatever. But let's get crazy. I like that mantra. For this talk on meteors and this meteor shower, let's get crazy. Remember, I said, let's assume that the concentration of material in the wake of that comet breakup is 10 times more than it was 5 years ago in 2017, when the comet gave us only 5 per hour, and now we think it may give us 14, and we timed that by 10 to get 140. Let's get crazy. Instead of 10 times more concentrated, how about we assume it's 100 times more? Well, then if we take 14 and multiply by 100, we're going to get not 140, but 1,400 meteors per hour. Now, the official designation of a meteor storm, not a shower, is 1,000 per hour. This would be a full-fledged meteor storm. If it were 100 times more concentrated, that would bring, 20, even 25 meteors per minute across your line of sight. That's pretty darn good. So maybe, just maybe, we might be in line for a meteor storm. Now, a couple of drawbacks. One of the drawbacks is this diagram that you see here. This is our Earth moving in its orbit around the sun. Well, some meteor showers, there's one in November called the Leonid shower. The meteors in that meteor shower, they're moving opposite to the orbit of the Earth. In other words, when the Earth encounters the Leonids, they hit the Earth head on at 72 kilometers a second. That's 45 miles a second. And I got to tell you that even a particle the size of a pea moving that quickly through our atmosphere leaves a beautiful, bright, that's the important word to use here, bright, incandescent trail of light which can hang in the sky for a few seconds. Whether you see only a few or whether you see a lot of Leonid meteors, you can count on one thing: they're all going to be bright. But now look at the meteors that we're talking about for later this month, the SW3 meteors. They are moving in the same direction as the Earth. So only meteors that can catch up with the Earth in its orbit are going to enter the atmosphere and produce a streak of light. And at 16 kilometers per second, 10 miles per second, they're only moving, less than a quarter as fast as the Leonids. So whereas the Leonids are bright, the SW3 meteors will probably be quite faint. In fact, come to think of it, when that other comet, Biela, broke up in 1872 and created that spectacular meteor shower, the unexpected meteor shower, the surprise shower, people who saw that said later on, or recording what had seen in the sky, they said the meteors were slow, faint, and evanescent. I didn't even know what evanescent meant, so I had to look it up in the dictionary. Evanescent, transitory, fleeting, vanishing. So the clue here is the majority of the SW3 meteors, just like the Bielid meteors of the 19th century, are probably going to be faint. However, there were a few that were quite bright. In fact, some of them exceeded first magnitude, brighter than the brightest stars in the sky, often appearing red with trains of orange sparks. So while the majority may be faint, some of them could be quite bright. In fact, 10 years ago, one observer in Ontario, Bootland Farm, Ontario, was looking skyward about the time when this meteor shower was to appear at the end of May, and he didn't see very many. He only saw one, but that one was a gorgeous, he said, magnitude -1. That meant brighter, or as bright as the brightest star in the sky, Sirius the Dog Star, golden yellow, and it left behind a thick wake. So maybe we might not see necessarily a lot of faint meteors. Maybe we might see a bunch of bright ones, just like this in the sky. So we're not sure because we've never been through this meteor trail of debris before. The meteors are going to be coming from this part of the sky, from the constellation of Boötes. And this map that you see here shows where the radiation point, the point where the meteors are all going to dart out from, will be appearing. Now, if you were on May 31st at 1 o'clock in the morning Eastern Time, if you happen to be in Baja California, that's good old Mexico, if you were there, you would have the radiation point of the meteors right above your head, squarely above your head. And all of these other circles indicate how far away or how low in the sky the meteors would be. 80 degrees high here, this part of the United States, 70 degrees, 60 degrees. We live between the 60 and the 50 degree line, right about here. Halfway between 50 and 60 is 55. So the point where the meteors are going to be radiating from will be 55 degrees up. You say, well, what's that? I don't have a sextant at home. How high is 55 degrees? Well, you don't have a sextant, but you do have one that you carry with you all the time. It's your hand. Make it into a clenched fist and hold the fist out at arm's length, and then place the bottom of your fist on the horizon and place so the top part of your fist, that would be equivalent to 10 degrees. That's how wide your fist is, approximately 10 degrees high. So as this girl is doing, you said the radiation point where all the meteors are going to be fanning out from, 55 degrees up. So this is what, 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees, 40 degrees. And then this young man here is even higher. He's going up to 50, 55 degrees. So 5.5 fifths up from the horizon, that's how high up the meteor radiant, the point where the meteors are going to be coming from, will be. More than halfway up in the sky. And this star map shows you where in the sky you should look. Now you look at a star map and that kind of, you say, well, I don't know any of the star patterns or the constellations. How am I going to find my way around the sky if I don't know it yet? Don't worry about it. You've seen the Big Dipper, I'm sure, at least once in your life, more than once, I'm sure. So if you were a Girl Scout, a Boy Scout, a campfire girl, well, at 1 o'clock in the morning on May 31st, a Tuesday morning, the Big Dipper will be in about halfway up in the northwestern part of the sky. There's the bowl, and there's the handle. Anybody could find the Big Dipper. 7 stars make up a beautiful, long-handled pan in the sky. Now, when you find it, take the handle of the Big Dipper and stretch a line through the handle, an arc, if you will. Take the arc and arc to this star here, Arcturus. And Arcturus is in Boötes, the constellation I said where the meteors would be fanning from. Now, Arcturus is one of the brightest, in fact, it's the second brightest star in our sky as seen from here in the tri-state New York area. And it shines or glows with a scintillating, beautiful yellow-orange color. So not only is it one of the brightest, it's also one of the more colorful. So all you have to do on that particular morning at that appointed hour is step outside, look toward the west, and about halfway up in the west, there will shine Arcturus for all to see. And the radiation or the apparent source of the meteors in the sky will be not too far away. And if you're lucky, the best piece of equipment I would use is a long lawn chair. Open it up, stretch it out, lie down on the lawn chair, and then look up into the sky. Don't stare at any one place, just keep looking all over. And pretty soon you'll see a streak in the sky and trace the streak backward. And then keep watching, another streak will come by. Trace that backwards also until you see the general area of the sky or the general pattern of stars. A third one will come by, hopefully intersect in the same place the first two did, and now that source of intersection is called the radiant, the apparent source of the meteors. That's where they'll all be fanning from. And I do hope that when you step outside, you won't need to find Arcturus. You will not need to find the Big Dipper. I'm hoping if you step outside that night at 1 o'clock in the morning, that once you step out, especially if you're in a nice dark area, you will immediately see shooting stars coming in all different directions of the sky, all radiating from that one spot. And we had the eclipse this past weekend with a full moon. When the meteors come to peak at the end of May, a week from this Tuesday night, a week from this Monday night or early Tuesday morning. When that happens, we are not going to have a full moon, which would normally squelch the light of many of those faint streaks. What we will have is a new moon, which means no light of any kind, no moonlight will interfere. A perfect scenario for viewing what we hope will be a very bright and entertaining display of meteors. Now, my final disclaimer before I close this out. I'm excited to see what happens, though I have to admit I won't be holding my breath. Meteor showers are notoriously fickle, and it's possible that nothing at all will occur on that appointed night in question. But that's not so bad. If you go to a spot where you can see a lot of stars, then you can at least lay back and enjoy the view of a starry nighttime sky. Always a wonderful sight to look at, not a waste of time at all. But as a historical pattern, if historical patterns are of any guide, I think we're long overdue for a meteor shower such as this, because over the last couple of centuries, it seems that a new, strong shower emerges seemingly from nowhere with some frequency. Take, for example, in April of 1803, the Lyrid meteor shower. Now, this shower comes along every year. Every year in April, the Lyrid shower occurs, produces 5 or 10 meteors an hour. No big deal, nothing to write home about. But in 1803, we apparently hit a thick clump of matter, a thick clump of debris, which was unanticipated. No one knew that was going to happen. And on that night, the church bell in Richmond, Virginia was rung and sounded to get people outside to look into the sky, because that night, well, the people looking skyward at all those shooting stars thought that the world was about to come to an end. Surprise! Surprise! No one knew that was going to come, but it did. And then again, that meteor display in 1872 from Biela's comet. We were looking for the twin comets, and they never returned in 1858 and 1865. But in 1872, we crossed the pulverized remains of that comet. And again, surprise! No one knew that meteor shower was going to occur, but it did. And those who were outside watching saw, again, a magnificent display of shooting stars. And in 1933, again, surprise! A comet by the name of Giacobini-Zinner passed around the sun. We went through its trail some days or some weeks later, and when we did, we saw meteors firing out of the head of the constellation of Draco the Dragon, which is located just north of the Big Dipper. And in Portugal and Spain and Ireland, people who were unaware that this was happening or was going to happen fell to their knees and thought they were witnessing the end of the world. Of course, it was no end whatsoever. So you see, we haven't had a surprise meteor shower pop up in quite a while. Maybe at 1 a.m. on May 31st of this year, early Tuesday morning, maybe this is going to be our shot. Maybe this is going to be our chance to see a glorious display of shooting stars, or at least a nice display of bright meteors, outstandingly bright meteors, fireballs, bolides. We don't know. We've never encountered this meteor shower before. But again, surprises do happen. And maybe this is going to be another one of those surprises. I'm going to be out that night. In fact, I'm going to be out in the western United States. I feel so confident about this that I'm actually going to be in Arizona, in a place where it is truly dark, no bright lights, and I'm hoping to be out there to observe a great meteor display. So I'll be out that night. I'll be outside watching. And the question is, will you?